Anyway, so dry brushing. Let's talk dry brushing. We've got a lot of open areas. We've got a lot of texture on this guy. Dry brushing obviously works best with texture. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work for open areas, okay? I would say that there's almost no perfect strategy for open areas. You know, contrast works okay, but you almost have to know what you're doing with contrast in order to get it to behave properly with open areas. You know, a solid base coat is always a good thing, but then if you're working with the zenithal foundation, you're almost ruining your lighting when you work with a you know, with a flat area like this. Friend's a huge One Piece fan. I've been trying to convince him to run a One Piece Spelljammer game. That would be so freaking cool. So what I would like to focus on specifically for this is like this area right here, okay? Because what the thing that Azera was talking about was she is painting BattleTech and is worried that if she primes them in black, that trying to then paint them tan or green would be difficult to achieve, because painting light over dark, which we all know is really difficult, wouldn't work, right? So I told her, dry brush a zenithal prime onto it. She was worried that if you dry brush, it will develop texture, which she's not wrong. It could develop texture. There are, as you know, ways to avoid that. So the point of this is to help establish what ways I'm speaking of, what ways to avoid that, right? The first and foremost is to make sure that you're keeping your brush hydrated. So as I mentioned before, this is my handy jar. I use pick-apart foam that I use just pulled out of my case that I put my minis in to transport them. You put a couple drops of water in there. You don't even need to hydrate it that often, because as long as you keep the cap on in between uses, you just tap it a couple times and you'll feel the brush. You'll feel the water on the brush. Usually I'll rub it on my thumb after that just to feel how much is on there. Usually there's already too much. So I just wipe it off until it's like mostly gone. Still feels a little cool to the touch when you touch it to your skin. That means that there's still a little bit of water on there, but not enough to run. That's what you want. Think about how the water is on the brush, on the bristles. If you were to move it across your hand, can you feel the water moving? If you can feel the water moving between the bristles, there's too much water on there. But you don't want no water on there, okay? Almost so little water that if you let it sit for too long, like more than a minute or two, it'll evaporate, and then you need to hydrate it again. So the idea is you hydrate it, immediately put it in the paint, and then work from there. The point is, you want the brush to be hydrated enough that it's not completely dry when you put it in the paint, but also not so hydrated that the paint will streak like crazy when you finally go to, well, I'm sorry, that has nothing to do with the streaking part. We'll get to that. Now we choose a color. I'm not terribly worried about what color I use here, because this is not how I was planning on painting this mini in the first place. I'm just using this as an example. So, colors notwithstanding, I'm just going to pick a color kind of arbitrarily here. What if we go for like a Babe the Big Blue Ox thing here, right? We'll start from a really dark purple. Alright, so I got a big dark purple. Big dark angry purple. Which again, over a zenithal is going to look a little weird, but we're just doing this for demonstration purposes. I want it to show up on stream, so we're gonna goof up this zenithal prime a little bit with this, but this is for learning. We're sacrificing the zenithal prime for learning. So again, hydrate brush, tap tap, rub it on your thumb a little bit. You can feel the water coming off. Okay, it's to the point we need it. Now I'm gonna take it over to, you know what? Let's get this on screen too if we can. I want you to be able to see this whole process. I gotta move some things around. Give me just a second. Okay, so hydrate, Wipe, wipe, wipe. Here's our purple right there. The dark one, not the purple underneath. I use a lot of purple. So I just dab it in there. Doesn't matter how much is on the brush, because you're going to end up just swiping it around. And you can already see, just from the few swipes I've put on there, it's reflecting a little much. But you can see it is a little streaky, which is not what we want. This is a heavy body acrylic, so it's going to appear a little streaky from the get-go. So I just keep swiping it until it's no longer streaky. It's leaving behind some pretty cohesive. Actually, it starts to get a little gummy. Gummy's a little bit too far, in my opinion, but for our purposes, it'll work here. So we get it to that point. You can see it's covering basically the entirety of the dome of the brush. That's what we want. We're going to test it on the back of our thumb. Couple swipes, not a lot of pigment. I can see it. You can't really see it on camera. Couple more swipes. You're starting to see pigment build up. Now you can see it on camera. A few more swipes. Now it's really starting to build. This is where we want the dry brush. That's where we want it to be. Same goes for zenithal priming too, if you're doing it by hand. You want it to be where you really kind of have to work it to build that pigment up. That's how you get a proper, zenithal, or that's how you get a proper dry brush. So dry brush is hydrated. It's loaded with paint. We go at it. You just start putting it on there, okay? It might come out as streaky at first on a flat surface. That's okay. If it does, just avoid that area for a couple of strokes. Once everywhere else has caught up with that color, then you can start adding it back into the process of, So this part is catching a lot of that color right off the rip, this top of the shoulder. So I'm just going to focus on this area for a little bit. Once this area catches up in terms of intensity, I'll go back up here and start adding it into the process again. So that now I'm including this 50% back in with this 50% once they've reached the same level of intensity. Okay, I'll show you again over here. Actually, the brush is getting a little bit dry now. It's already dried out. So what we do, go back to the jar, paint and all, right? Dab. Check it on your palette once it's been dabbed, because we got moisture on there again. It's going to reactivate that paint. Notice I'm not adding more paint. I'm just reactivating the paint we have on the brush. So dab. We got moisture on there. Check it on the palette. You can already tell. See, it's already activated the paint again, but it's very streaky. So we kind of wipe it off until it gets a little gummy again. This part's a little tricky. This is where it might get streaky again. So you kind of have to be careful. Always check on your thumb. There's a little extra moisture this time, but that's okay. Pigment's picking up a little bit sooner than a couple swipes, but it's pretty consistent. As long as the motion provides a consistent amount of distribution of paint, you're fine, okay? So we're going to try it on this side now. Couple swipes, you're already starting to see pigment build up. Perfect. That's what we want. So the thing in dry brushing that causes texture is what you would imagine you want in dry brushing, which is dryness. It's called dry brushing. You think you would want it to be dry, but that dryness is actually what causes that texture to build up, right? In reality, it should be called like humid brush. Because you don't want it to be dry. You don't want it to be completely dry. You want it to be somewhat moist. But somewhat moist brush doesn't sound as good as dry brush. I think we can all agree. The big keys. I'll summarize with a few major points before we wrap up the tutorial, okay? But one question you might have, when do I reload the brush? When do I know there's not enough paint on there? Usually after 1 or 2 times of re-wetting and using the pigment that's already on there, it's time to reload. Because you're going to run low on the pigment. You can already start to see on the brush it's fading out a little bit. It's not as concentrated. The dark is still, or the center is still pretty dark, but the rest of the brush is losing a lot of that intensity around the edges. The edges are where you're going to get a lot of that paint deposited. So now go back to your palette, dab a couple times, swirl it around again. It's also important to kind of like spin your brush in the paint a little bit. That's what gets all those edges. Okay, we're getting to that gummy texture again. As soon as the brush starts feeling, you feel like a little bit of resistance. There's like a little bit of a gumminess to it. That's when you know it's time to test. Because that means, typically what that means is that all those little bristles on the dry brush are starting to kind of stick together instead of spreading separately. When they all spread out like that, that means they're very wet and they're also acting independently. What you want is for them to kind of hug a little bit, but not too much. If they do it too much, that's when you get those big streaks, right? But you also don't want them spread out so much that you're getting this really powdery, dry brush. You want this happy medium where everybody is like adequately saturated. It's kind of like a party, right? It's like a wedding. You don't want a dry wedding, but you also don't want you don't want people at a wedding to be way too sloppy drunk, right? You want it right in the middle. And it's hard. It's hard to achieve that. Because if you have an open bar, you got to hope everybody behaves themselves. And honestly, if you're finding that you have to work kind of hard to get that pigment off of your brush onto the model, that's okay. It's actually not bad. Okay? Because then you have more control. You have more control over the final over how much pigment you're depositing on the mini. If you have more control over it, it will take longer, but you're going to have a lot more say in what the final product appears, how it appears. So as you can see, we've got, this is dry brushed. This is a very atypical dry brush, because normally you're using dry brushing to highlight, right? We just used it to kind of cover this model. I wanted to show you what you could do to cover a model that has a different color. We went light to dark. Light to dark is always going to be easier to paint, but I just used it so that you could see the contrast between, you know, the lighter color being covered by a darker color with the dry brush. And the idea is that I'm clipping this and sending it to a friend for a tutorial, but I was hoping it would be helpful for other people too. But yeah, so the key takeaways from this. Number one, dry brush, not a great name for it, but it's the best name that we can use because other names sound bad. Number two, dry brushing is kind of like a wedding. You want things to be just lubricated enough that everybody's getting along, but not too lubricated to the point where everybody's getting along, you know what I'm saying? And by everybody, I mean the bristles in the brush. So you want everybody kind of like gathered together. You don't want them spread all the way apart, because that keeps things dry, like if it were a dry wedding, right? You don't want to be too dry. That causes friction, that causes buildup, that causes texture, okay? But you also don't want it to be too lubricated, because then everybody, that's when the bridesmaids, you know, start leaving the wedding a little bit early with too many people. You know what I'm saying? Like too many, not even the bridesmaids. Let's say the groomsmen too. You know what I'm saying? That's when things get a little bit. Yeah, like Adonalzia said here. That's when the wedding ends in an orgy. Okay, to extend the metaphor without getting problematic. We're just being funny here, but 3, keep your dry brush hydrated. use a sponge. You want the dry brush to be hydrated when you add the paint. And then the paint will continue to keep the dry brush hydrated because the paint is thicker than the water. However, as you dry brush, it will get drier. So go back, dip the brush in the sponge again. It'll reactivate the paint that's in there. So rather than adding more paint to the dry brush, which will also cause texture, because if you add paint to dry paint, you're going to get texture. So don't add more paint every time you go back to reload your dry brush. Wet it first. Use that. Do it at least twice, then add more paint. That's a big one. I think that's all the major points. Don't forget to clean your brushes. What about the wedding with an unlimited margarita fountain? I've walked out of a meeting and into some dry brush chaos. Would you expect anything less? It's helpful for me. Thank you for the tutorial. I'm glad it was helpful for you. I'm excited to hear that. We were not even anticipating painting today. We were just in the middle of we're in the middle of Coral Island, and our friend Azera in chat was asking about dry brushing, and I was like, why don't we do a tutorial?